We're just checking in a few more people that are arriving before we begin, but I can go ahead and get my housekeeping out of the way. If you would please take a moment to silence your cell phones and devices, and then hold your questions, please, to the end of our presentation. We'll have some time at the end for audience Q&A. So we'll just get started in a few minutes. Good evening. My name is Lana Metter, and I am the Associate Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art here at SAMA, and I'm so delighted to see such a full house here this evening. And let's say this auditorium has never looked so incredibly wonderful. I can't take credit for this. I want to thank David Zamora Casas, who installed this amazing, beautiful, thoughtful tribute to our speakers this evening. So thank you to him. We're all here tonight for what promises to be an incredible evening of conversation with two highly esteemed speakers that are leaders in their field of Chicano studies and the visual arts, and whose work has influenced generations of scholars, artists, and writers. Tonight's program celebrates the opening of our exhibition, Amalia Mesa-Bains, Archaeology of Memory, and the museum is absolutely thrilled to be a partner on the tour of this traveling retrospective, one that is long overdue and which honors over 45 years of influential artistic practice of Amalia Mesa-Bains, including her pioneering work in the genre of altar installation. The exhibition was organized by the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive in collaboration with the Latinx Research Center at UC Berkeley, and we're grateful for their partnership. It was co-curated by Maria Esther Fernandez, the artistic director of the Cheech Marin Center for Chicano Art and Culture at Riverside. Yes, and thank you for being here tonight. And Laura Perez, professor of Chicanx, Latinx, and Ethnic Studies, and chair of Latinx Research Center at UC Berkeley. The exhibition is made possible by generous lead support from the Henry Luce Foundation and the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts. And here in San Antonio, the exhibition is generously supported by the Brown Foundation, with additional funding from the John R. and Greli N. Charitable Trust, the Marcia and Otto Koehler Foundation, and Chave and Bill Gonzaba. So thank you for supporting this very important project. I also want to acknowledge that SAMA's lectures and artist conversations are made possible with generous support from the Louis A. and Francis B. Wagner Lecture Fund. Tonight is a special evening. We have not only the exhibition catalog for sale in our gift shop, but we also have a brand new publication that is here just in time for this talk. And we want to thank the UCLA Chicano Studies Research Center for making sure we were able to have plenty of copies available here to celebrate this wonderful conversation. And the publication is called Amalia Mesa-Bains, Rituals of Memory, Migration, and Cultural Space. And it's part of their Aver Revisioning Art History book series, and it is authored by Tomás Ybarra-Frausto. So we're thrilled to have both of those books for you. They're both available for purchase through our gift shop. Our galleries do close at 7 o'clock tonight, but I understand the gift shop will stay open for a few minutes after that if you would like to purchase a book after the talk. And then, of course, you can also purchase those on our website through our gift shop. And so now I'll give a brief introduction to our speakers. It's certainly a summary of the many wonderful things they've done in their careers and accolades they've received. If I was to go over all of them, we'd be here all evening, and I want to get to the important part and hear from our speakers. Tomás Ybarra-Frausto is an independent scholar of Latina and Latino arts and culture. And we are also proud that he is a San Antonian. Yay. Dr. Ybarra-Frausto has taught at Stanford University, the University of California at San Diego, and the University of Washington. He also served as Associate Director of Creativity and Culture at the Rockefeller Foundation. In 2007, the Smithsonian Institution awarded him the Henry Medal, which recognizes individuals for service, achievements, and contributions that add to the honor and growth of the Smithsonian. Mexico has awarded him the prestigious Order of the Aztec Eagle due to his lifelong work nurturing a cultural understanding between the United States and Mexico by way of arts and humanities. Ybarra-Frausto has been published in numerous books, exhibition catalogs, and journals, and he is the author of the highly influential essay, Rascuachismo, A Chicano Sensibility. Amalia Mesa-Bains is an artist, educator, cultural critic who is based in the San Francisco Bay Area. Her artwork often honors empowered, brilliant, larger-than-life, and irrepressible women, and she indeed is one of those women herself. She received her BA in painting from San Jose State College, her MA in interdisciplinary education from San Francisco State University, and her PhD in clinical psychology from the Wright Institute. She spent 20 years teaching in San Francisco public schools, has held a University of California Regents professorship, and was director of Institute for Visual and Public Art at California State University. In 1993, she received the prestigious MacArthur Genius Grant. She has been the recipient of numerous other accolades and has authored dozens of books and articles. Her work is in collections of esteemed public institutions, including the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and the National Gallery of Art. So please help me in welcoming Tomás Ybarra-Frausto and Amalia Mesa-Bains.
Hello? Can you hear me? Okay.
Buenas noches. Good evening. First, I give a heartfelt thank you to the compañeras and compañeros who provided input during the many years gestation of my biography memoir titled Amalia Mesa-Bains, Rituals of Memory, Migration, and Cultural Space. I dedicate my book and tonight's conversation to Dudley Brooks, my longtime partner. My longtime partner and compañero who departed this world in 2022. Que en paz descanse. Amalia Mesa-Bains and I have been compañeros for many decades and are members of a cohort of scholars, activists, and artists who came to conscience and consciousness in the tumultuous and by now mythic 1960s, an era when el movimiento Chicano mobilized thousands of Americans of Mexican descent into militant struggles for civil rights, cultural equity, and self-determination. Poets, writers, musicians, and filmmakers wrote the poems, signed the manifestos, sang the songs, made the movies, and harnessed the visual arts to create un nuevo arte del pueblo, a new art of the people. From the social, cultural, and political practices of daily life, la casa, the house, la calle, the street, and la comunidad, the community, provided boundless nutrient sources of images for the visual expressions of movimiento artists. Amalia, please provide some commentary on your participation in el movimiento.
Well, I want to say before I even answer that question that Tomás has been more than a compañero. He's been really, in a way, a soulmate, someone who shared with me many life events inside and outside of the cultural wars. And I'm extremely grateful for him for the years and years he's put into writing this book. Now, my encounter with el movimiento was a slippery one. I was a little bit older than many of the people coming in, and it's safe to say women did not take the lead at the beginning. And that's a very nice way to say that it was a little bit patriarchal, but that's okay. My first encounter was Luis Valdez, who founded Teatro Campesino. We were at San Jose State in the 60s, and he was in my theater class. Actually, he was in theater, I was in literature at the time, and we were in a class called the literature, romantic literature of England. And we were reading Wordsworth, Shelley, Keats, the boys in the band, as they say. And every time he came in, I got nervous because I was very whiteified then. I wasn't really, I knew I wasn't American. Clearly, I was not quite Mexican either. I'd never been there. So I was somewhere in between. And just trying to get by. And every time he spoke, and that incredible voice, and he was always dressed in flak jacket, Ray-Bans, and had these beautiful babes on his arms for the theater companies. This was prior to Luce, so I can say that. And I watched, my husband and I were living together, and we were next door to the Teatros group on campus, and they were doing the Shrunken Head of Pancho Villa. And they used to practice in a refrigerator box with a little head sticking out. And I watched them every day when they practiced, and I understood what was happening. We went to the premiere, the world premiere of the Shrunken Head of Pancho Villa, but I don't think I really fully understood. I didn't use the term Mexican-American because it didn't really fit. I really didn't have a designation. I was sort of in a lost little space there. And in many ways, my husband's involvement with the Congress on Racial Equality when we were in San Jose was my first introduction to civil rights and to the defiance that comes with living in that space. And then when we moved to San Francisco and I went into a program called Teacher Corps, I was blessed to be mentored by a woman named Yolanda Garfias-Wu. She's very, very well known within the communities in San Francisco. She's from Oaxacan descent. She was a backstrap loom weaver. She was my mentor and my professor. And through her, I met the people at Casa Hispana de Bellas Artes who were doing the first show, going to Delano, 1969. And then she introduced me to Ralph Maradiaga at the Galeria de la Raza. And that's when my life began, around 71, 72, when they first started. And so I was in the movimiento in a way that had to do more with cultural work. And of course, we supported the Huelga. My first Chicano art that I made went to a show during the Huelga that traveled to Delano and, of course, never came back. But that always happened then, so we didn't worry about it. And that was my first glimpse of the possibilities of what I could have in my life. And often people ask me, why do you still use the term Chicano? You know, you can just say you're an American artist, you're Amalia Mesa-Bains. And I said, I don't think you understand. It's my way of establishing the source of the energy, the love, the passion, and the defiance that have marked me, my life, my marriage, my friends, and I never give that up. And I'm many other things, I understand that, but I am a Chicana through and through, down to my toes and up to my head, and I'll always be that way. And so I feel really happy when Tomás gives me the chance to talk about this.
A family album. Amalia Maxine Mesa was born in 1943 to parents who were brought to the United States as children during the turbulent years of the Mexican Revolution. Her family established deep roots in the Santa Clara Valley of California. Amalia, your mother, uncle, grandmother, and spouse, Richard Bains, are all significant figures in your life and artistic accomplishments. From childhood to adulthood, please comment on their influence in your life and art.
Oh, that's a big one. I always make sure people understand. My parents came in a rocky time. My father came in as a toddler. He was about 4 years old, and the Mexican Revolution was on. And the family lost everything. They were on the wrong, very embarrassing for Chicano, wrong side of the revolution. My grandfather, Rafael Mesa, was actually working for the military, signing the vouchers. So he was executed, and my grandmother was very bereft and eventually came with my father, a newborn baby, and her 3 brothers into the U.S. My mother walked across on a day pass with her family. Neither one of my parents were documented. So I lived in an undocumented family. It's hard to believe, but they didn't get their papers until I was at Cal State University, Monterey Bay, and they were in their 80s and 70s. Actually, my father was close to 90. And so I understood that life, and I was very bad at it. You know, you're supposed to behave well, don't cast any aspersion in him. And what we're looking now are my grandmother and her brothers, my grantios. And you can see they're exceptionally big and tall. And I didn't discover until much later that they're mixed race. You know, I knew that, I assumed they were mestizo, but I didn't understand the African part of my family until I was much older, because people never talked about it then. The tercer raíz is well known now, but it wasn't acknowledged then. And my grandmother was born in the late 1800s. She was 5'6", weighed about 175 pounds. My uncles were 6 feet, 6'3". They were big people, and they worked hard. They were farm workers. She kept that family together with intermittent husbands, or whatever we called them. And I never knew anyone but her. She was like my immaculate conception, you know. She didn't have to have a man. She was my grandmother. She's the abuela, you know. She was tough as nails, and you don't fool around with her. But she is the source of much of the work I do. You see her face in Prenderas Botanica. You see her in many, many of the works that I have done. My parents were a great creative support. I am the 3rd generation intermarried. I'm the 3rd generation artist. So I had the support of a family who, in a way, it was sort of prophetic. They were waiting for me. You know, they knew. First time I picked up a pencil, I was about 4, and I tried to draw, and I remember watching the line come out of the pencil, and thinking that it was magic. And wherever I moved the pencil, a little line followed until finally I realized it was me, the pencil, and the line, and I was drawing. So my father, by that time, was no longer a farm worker. He had become part of a grocery business with an uncle. And so he would canvass the butcher shops in the area. In those days, they had rolls of paper. They were kind of pinkish. And when they get to the end of the roll, they couldn't use them because they were crinkly on the edges. So they would cut it off for him. He would cut them into squares, put rocks on them, and they bought me an easel when I was 7. And he continued to find paper for me all of those years. And when I went to high school, I was the only student that had a full oil painting kit that they spent a fortune on. And so I had permission from the very beginning. And I think in many ways, because they had lived an agricultural life, my father and my grandparents and my uncles, my mother had been a maid, I understood work, I understood labor. Richard, my husband, always says he married me first and foremost, not for my great intellect or beauty, but because I got up at 4:30 in the morning to walk to a bus, to take a bus to a cannery in Redwood City, to walk across the railroad tracks, to go in that cannery and do my work and come home. And I did it. I paid my way all through school by working every summer in the cannery, which would overlap for about a month into the school year. So it would transfer to the night shift so that I could go to school in the day. So he decided right then and there, this woman is a worker. Let's stay with her. So I think of that upbringing as is quite privileged, even though I've imagined from other people's point of view, we did not have a lot. But I never went without. My mother was a fashionista and a seamstress, and she made my clothes for me. And there were just so many parts. There she is, that beautiful girl. That's Marina Gonzalez Mesa, who took her picture then at the age of, I think, 22 in the Pacific Palisades in the moon. So that's my mom in the moon. And I made a print of it that you'll see in the Cihuatlampa section where Coco Chanel is staring up at her and dreaming of my mother.
Amalia, from what you've been telling us, you became aware of your identity as a Mexican American. How did you negotiate between the two cultures, the Mexican and the Anglo-American?
I have to say, it was really difficult when I was a child, because I sometimes would say to my mother, am I Mexican? She said, of course, mija, you're Mexican. I said, okay. Then I'd go to school, come home and say, Mom, am I American? She said, yes, mija, you were born here. So after a while, I finally said, well, how do I be two things? She said, oh, it's easy. You're just American, sometimes outside, and then you're Mexican in the house. And so I understood that meant, I could, it's what we call code switch, But I have to say that I paid a price for it. And, I went to school. My first schooling in kindergarten was 1948. I was born in 43. And I discovered much later that 1948 was when the first Mexicans were integrated in California into public schools because of the Menendez battle over the rights of their daughter, way before Brown, versus, was it Kansas? In any event, I did recognize the discrimination. It was inevitable, impossible to ignore. And I just learned what I considered then the polite Mexican way. And my mother always said, you don't say things to them. When my parents had been young and they wanted to move from one side of Wilshire Boulevard to the other in Los Angeles, the people were going to rent this it was just a little cottage to them. And then the neighbors in the neighborhood found out they were moving in and they got a little protest going. And so the woman had to say to my parents, I'm sorry, you can't live here. And my mother and father would tell the story and they would always say, well, maleducados, why do you want to be with those people? I mean, they're not good people. So we didn't bother and we just stayed where we were living and we found another place. So I grew up with that sense that one simply had more grace and more upbringing than to make a fuss. And it wasn't until I met Richard and we went to our first restaurant and they didn't want to wait on us. But I didn't know that. He knew right away. We kept waiting. Other people were taken in and we were waiting. And then finally, Richard said something like, I want to see the manager. And the woman said, well, I think I can help you. He said, no, you're the problem. Get the manager. And by then, I'm like turning 3 shades of red, and I'm telling him I'm not hungry. Oh, we can go now. I really don't care. I'm not hungry. And I realized that I had to learn through his help that when a boundary is put in front of you, if it is not fair or equitable, you kick it. You get at it. And I've learned slowly in those years, and that's when I was in my early 20s, that you don't stand for things that you know are unfair and are not correct. But I didn't know for many years. So I would say that for me, the negotiation around what I call being whiteified and becoming a Chicana, there was sort of a gap because I really couldn't be a Mexican because I'd never been there. And because of the way my grandfather's and grandmother's family had come into the U.S. during this really epic, revolutionary, and tumultuous time, there was never a talk of our family. I had no connection to Mexico, unlike people like Carmen Lomas Garza or Cesar Hernandez or everyone that I knew who had family in Mexico. I did not. And I never knew until later that I did. But I have to say that the Chicano movement was the saving grace. The day that I went to the Galeria and I met the other mujeres was the day I was born again. Really, truly.
I want to talk a little bit about you and Richard. When you and Richard were in a community of artists of all disciplines, creating cultural spaces that formed aesthetic paradigms, closing the gap between life and art. Equally potent in California at this time, I'm talking about the hippie movement. Was the anti-establishment youth culture associated with communal love, spiritual realization, and altered states of consciousness sustained by hallucinogenic drugs. Amalia, can you talk about your participation in the California anti-establishment youth culture?
Oh, yeah, I can. Richard's sitting over there. Oh, she's going to tell it again. But when you read the book, if you get the book, there's a section at the beginning of Family Album, and it talks about the early years of Richard and I. He was in a rock band. I was an artist. I had a studio in the Haight-Ashbury. And yes, I loved dropping acid. It opened up this whole visual world of color and just transformation. And I'm very proud of the fact that it's in the book. There's a picture of me. It's on the street in Rags magazine. And Rags magazine was an offshoot of Rolling Stone. It was the first and only fashion magazine they had. So I was very proud that I was on the street. They photographed me. And then Richard and I won the cover of another illustrated hassle-free sew your own book, a clothes book, which was a group of hippies, many of them fashion designers, who wrote a book on how to make clothes yourself. And so those years were really important. And at the same time, as that ended, we moved, I think, more into urban life in San Francisco. And I joined something called Teacher Corps, which is how I became mentored by Yolanda Garcia Swoop. Teacher Corps brought people of color into minority areas in the school district. I was on the mission team. There was a team of African Americans in Western Addition and Hunters Point. There were Asians in Chinatown. So we all fit in. And our closest sort of, I guess, allies in the struggle were the other blacks in the Black Panther movement. And many of the people who were in our program were part of the Black Panthers. And eventually they took away their draft deferment and they were yanked out of the program. And I remember the period of time when our phones were tapped. And I remember a period of time in which people died that we knew. And it was another part of my politicization is understanding COINTELPRO. I didn't know what COINTELPRO was. And then I experienced it firsthand. And I realized this really does happen. The government really does do these kinds of things. So it was a very interesting move from the sort of peace and love, flowers in the muzzles of guns, happy days, wearing whatever I wanted or not wearing whatever I wanted. And then moving into the politics that came through Teacher Corps and then through the Chicano movement. And I think in some ways, when you look at my art, there's a little bit of both in there. There's a lot of things that have to do with the freedom of the body, the movement toward beauty and aestheticization. At the same time, how do you define a Chicano? They're always pissed off, so I'm a little bit mad. I'm better now, I'm much better now, but it took me years and years to get over it. It's why I wrote, it's why I organized, or why I advocated, and why the women who are my comadres, Judy Baca, most kick-ass person you'll ever meet, aside from Marta Moreno Vega from the Caribbean Cultural Center, also very, very, they're women who stand up, and they don't have to be asked. They defend others, not just themselves. They stand for something that helps all of us. So for me, that's how it all started, that early movement, the early moments of politicization. And, I guess those of us here who've been in different movements know that solidarity is at the core of what we do. And we carry solidarity with us most of our lives. It's why we make alliances and partnerships and collaborations. And whether we're working in a museum or working in organizing farm workers, whatever we're doing, solidarity is at the core of the heart of what we do. Yeah.
Amalia, I wanted to talk about how all these life experiences were nutrient sources for your art. Could you talk about that a little, about the nutrient sources in your artwork?
Yes, and Tomás is using a term that actually we coined together along with cultural reclamation. Those were terms, imagine these are young people, 20s and 30s, and they're trying to make sense out of how it is that we shall move forward, advocating for social justice, but also reclaiming culture that we gave up or were taken from us. The acculturation process in America often strips you from the things that your parents knew and your parents used. Cunenderismo, the ofrendas, the home altars, our food, so many, many things we adapted and changed. And so for me, it was home altars. Some of these images come from Dana Salvo's book, Mexican Home Altars. You ever get a chance to get it? It's an extraordinary book. He's a wonderful photographer. So those kinds of things. My mother had been, I don't say abandoned, but she was left behind as a child in an Italian convent outside of Los Angeles. So I didn't grow up with the Virgen de Guadalupe. I grew up with the Virgin Mary because my mother had been raised by these Italian nuns. And so she kept a very particular kind of altar. My grandmother, on the other hand, had Guadalupe, San Martin. She had all of those things. So I grew up between those kinds of altars. And I didn't practice the Day of the Dead, but I'm telling you, we spent more time in the graveyard than most people do in Disneyland, honestly. We were always cleaning, trimming the grass, washing the headstones, and talking about people. Walking around the cemetery going, oh, you remember your tio so-and-so. Oh, he loved your mother's menudo. And then they would just go on and on. And I grew up with the living dead. And I don't mean any zombie movie. I mean, you're at a table and you're having dinner, and they're not there, but they're there because everybody keeps mentioning them. And so I grew up toward the Day of the Dead without even knowing the Day of the Dead. And it wasn't until Yolanda Garfias-Wu took me in hand, and she was Oaxaqueña, she really knew all of it. And she taught me about the Day of the Dead. And she also introduced me to the Mesoamerican world. They're two things that I'm grateful to her for all my life because it changed my way of being. But the Days of the Dead seemed so natural to me that I sort of ended up becoming an altarista without even planning to. It's that at that time in the movement, people took on roles. You're going to do this and you're going to do that. And I wasn't a printmaker and I wasn't a very good painter. So it was me and the ofrendas, me and the altares. And then I eventually turned that into something else. But that's how I began. So I think in some ways the nutrient sources that we talked about in the years and days that we were building our ideas, they really were from our families. And then I have some that come from the whole experience with African American culture. I mean, I grew up in a mixed race family, even when they didn't acknowledge it. I married Richard when I was quite young. I lived through all of the years of his family. And it's made me a different kind of person. Sometimes when I would go into meetings, because I was in the school district and different kinds of organizations, and I'm an organizer by heart, and so I would go in there, and sometimes people would make remarks about blacks as though I wasn't black. And of course I wasn't, but they didn't know that I was in my way. And so then I'd have to say to them, why do you say things like that? Aren't you embarrassed? That's just so unacceptable. And they would look at me like, why? Why do you care? Why does it matter? And I found after years of this that I just had to go in right away and announce, hi, I'm Amalia. Oh, have you met my husband, Richard Mays? He's African-American. I get it out of the way. For years I did it so that nobody would embarrass himself by being an idiot in front of me. And I mean, seriously, we're all in this together, and it's part of our job to advocate across the cultures, across the races, to make a better place for ourselves. But I would say that that was really one of the most important nutrient sources to me.
Thank you, Amalia. Now I'm going to give you a lesson on Rasquachismo. I'm going to read just a couple of paragraphs from this essay manifesto that I wrote many years ago, and people are still using it in their classes. So here it is. It's a lesson on Rasquachismo. Rasquachismo, published in 1988, and Domesticana, The Sensibility of Chicana Rasquachismo, published in 1995, are both essay manifestos articulating an aesthetic discourse, a mode of artistic practice and cultural production. I have postulated the sensibility of Rasquachismo as a core aesthetic category in Chicano cultural production. Chicano vernacular theorizing arises within conditions of scarcity.
Yes.
Aesthetic strategies are derived and encoded in folk saying, hacer de tripas corazón, making do with what you have. The aim is to recycle materials, often in new contexts. Old tires become shoe soles, or ornamental garden containers. Yes. Discarded oil drums become barbecue pits. Chicano artists subvert the consumer ethic of mainline culture with strategies of appropriation, reversal, and inversion. Rasquachismo is not a style, but more of an attitude or taste. Very generally, Rasquachismo is rooted in resourcefulness and adaptability, yet mindful of stance and style. To be Rasquache is to posit a body, spunky, subversive consciousness. Outsider outlook cultures like homosexuals and lesbians, with their refined sense of illusion and transformation, are nutrient sources for a Rasquache sensibility. In the realm of taste, to be Rasquache is to be unfettered and unrestrained, to favor the elaborate over the simple, the flamboyant over the severe. Bright colors, chillantes, are preferred to somber, high intensity to low, the shimmering and sparkling over the muted and subdued. Ornamentation and elaboration prevail, joined to a delight in texture and sensuous surface. Rasquachismo is a vernacular system of taste that is ironic in its combination of the sentimental and the sincere. Mesa-Bains tested and expanded the limits and subtleties of my Rasquachismo essays in her much discussed and important essay manifesto, Domesticana, The Sensibility of Chicana Rasquache. Could you talk about Domesticana?
Yes. When I first read Rasquachismo, I thought, oh my God, he just described me. It was so on the mark, especially the shimmering part, because I was like sparkly things. And, we all grew up with, capillas in the front yard, corrals in the back, where you had little coffee cans where people took cuttings and traded them to each other and grew plants. And so all of those things, and I remember people saying, oh, she's so Rasquache, she had a safety pin on her bra strap. And it was like, well, she had to make do. She can't go out without one, So that, for me, it was like, I understood it, and yet I felt sometimes maybe we need to talk about how women do it. And for me, it became also a way to sort of slip into the discourse on feminism, which I was not comfortable with for many, many years. And by that, no offense to anyone, but what I describe as white feminism, and it was being posited by some very brilliant scholars. Only one did I follow, Griselda Pollock, and she was a person who I felt sort of had some sense of what we were talking about. And so when I started thinking about Domesticana, which was not even a name then, it was just an idea, I thought, well, we take our nutrient sources from my grandmother teaching me to crochet, or the home altars, or the scratchy little ways that my mother had, like my father, had a golden panther on the top of the TV that had a planter in the back with greenery. One of my favorite things, I still have it. It's going to show up in my installations one day. So I began to think, how would I describe this for women, and why would it matter? And it would matter because we were living within a culture, Mexican culture, that was patriarchal, within a society that was uber patriarchal. And what was our way out? And one of the reasons that I never could adapt to white feminism is it's sort of that throwing the baby out with the bathwater. My father was a very important part of my life. My mother and my grandmother also. But I couldn't make a distinction and say, well, these men are my enemy, or they're not useful to me. I had to really find a way to talk about it through the lens of family. And I began to think about the domestic container. How is it that we decorate our homes? Many Chicanos have a kitchen altar. I've always noticed that because it's sort of a place you spend a lot of time, so you put things in there. And so eventually I started thinking I wanted to write about it, and write about it in a way that it had to do with breaking that container, and how it is sometimes we take the very things that imprison us and we use it to make a paradise. And part of the second chapter of Venus Envy, the harem and other enclosures, is about that. How you can be contained, but within that container, you can make such beautiful things, and you strengthen yourself until the day you're ready to get out of that container. And eventually you must, and you do. So Domesticana was really, I think, an extension of Rasquachismo, but it was also very particular to women. And I used it to try and describe the work of people like myself. And I remember Patricia Rodriguez did a nicho box that was called the sewing box. And little drawers came out. It was all painted turquoise blue. And at the top drawers, really beautiful things, little, threads and jewels and buttons. But by the bottom, there were soldiers, little rubber soldiers laying flat on the ground, going to war. So there was this place that she had constructed in which it shifted from the most domestic to the most violent, and understanding that that little sewing box was a reflection of the world she knew. And others, myself, my Dolores Del Rio piece, I think, it was one of my early forays into Rasquachismo, in the sense of collecting all these little objects. And up until Dolores, I had been doing more traditional altars, 3 tiers. And when Dolores happened, and I met her the year before she died, still the most stunningly beautiful woman. And for those who are young, Dolores Del Rio was a Mexican and American movie star who was one of the few women, and my mother introduced me to her by watching old late show movies on our first TV set. And it was this idea of this transcultural figure, this woman who could be beautiful in American standards and could be beautiful in Mexican standards. And so I began to think about her. And then when I met her and saw who she really was, they had done a film survey of her work at the San Francisco Film Festival, and they brought her from Mexico. She died the next year, but she was still absolutely elegant. She sat on a stage in a velvet dress that was dark green plaid, and she had cuffs on her dress that were cut on the bias, so they fluted. And it was very dark. And every time she spoke, she moved her hands, and these little flashes of white came around her hands. And when I saw her outside of that theater, she was equally as beautiful. So when she died, I thought, well, I have to do something. And so I went to the Mexican Museum and I asked them if I might be able to do something. At that time, Adriana Williams had donated the Covarrubias collection to them. And for those who don't know, Miguel and Rosa Covarrubias were very good friends with the very elite of Mexico at that time, the Riveras, Frida Kahlo, and of course, Dolores. So they had photographs of Dolores doing yoga in a little sunsuit on the beach. Things you'd never dream that she did. And so they let me use those pictures. And when I was starting to do it, I thought, you know, she's so beautiful, she deserves a vanity. So I began to create my first vanities. And that was the break from the traditional altar into the innovation. And frankly, I never turned back again. I still do, and I'm working with the staff here at SAMA and designed the Emma Tenayuka altar for Day of the Dead. So that will have tears. I'm going to stop there because I know we have to keep ourselves on track.
Well, now that we talked a little bit about Domesticana, I want to talk again a little bit about Rascuachismo, because I think sometimes it's a patriarchy. I'm returning back to the patriarchy. So we can see some slides, please.
I think are you the Avalos ones? The Avalos images?
Yeah,
Yeah, they came already,
yeah.
but we could bring them back. There, yeah.
Yeah, these are okay. Let me just go back. If you could go back, yeah, the first one, the first, go back one more. Yes. So this is, these were taken here by Catherine O'Rourke here in San Antonio, and it's an example of sort of environmental Rascuachismo. Rascuachismo has an affinity with the Baroque. So you can see, you know, a lot of what the Baroque means. It's a decorative excess, theatricality, artifice. Next one, please. And this is an example in the visual arts. This is David Avalos. It's called Hubcap Milagros. And again, he used a hubcap from a car, and then he made a wonderful combination by putting it in you can see a Christ child, a Christ symbol, and then he took some little twerks and put them in there and made a beautiful art piece. Next. And this is, again, it's called Manhattan Special. Manhattan Special, it's a plate, and it's a shoe, a lady's shoe, and there's a drink behind the shoe. She's stepping on it. Another example of Rascuachismo. This is, next please. This is Ruben Trejo from the Pacific Northwest, and he did a series of crosses, 42 crosses, using the materials that farm workers used to plow and to you know open the furrows and so on. And so he used those, and he made this, and he called it a Rascuache cross. Next. And this is, again, Ruben Trejo from the state of Washington, and it's called Codex for the 21st Century. And he sort of went back to the Mexican codices and took spikes and built them into like what he called like his own alphabet. It's an old alphabet, and so he said, again, this is my idea of what a Rascuache, taking and making what you have and using it to make a beautiful art piece. So now we go back, Amalia, back to your, I wrote that, this is the question. How do large and powerful women who stand up to authority use fashion and clothing in their uncontained rebellions?
See. Well, I bet all the girls in the audience could tell us. This is really actually part of the whole section where we're starting to talk about how I'm finding a form. And I mentioned earlier that breaking out of the three-tiered altar into the vanity, and from the vanity into this piece from the Holy Communion, which is really the first chapter of Venus Envy. And what I learned from my mother, of course, was about clothing. And I did have a fashion business during the 80s, a little bit in the 70s, and again in the 80s. So fashion, fabric, drapery, embellishment, all of those are part of the way in which I kind of sanctify a space, how I make it sacred for me. But one of the things that happened along the way is that I began to feel not that I didn't want to do the ofrendas and altars anymore, but that I wanted to have the liberty to move further out into space itself. And so I began the chapters looking at ways in which I might use three-dimensional space, create environments, kind of loosen the boundaries, engage people. Mirrors are part of that, and the Holy Communion piece. Mirrors allow people to see themselves in those pieces. So in my sort of way of elaborating the lives of women, which I didn't actually start to do that, because as I said, I didn't have a terminology for feminism. And then people started saying, but Amalia, you're doing feminist work. And I said, I am, aren't I? And they said, yes, you are. And so I accepted that I was doing that. And I began to look at my own life. And so what I picked in the chapters that you'll see when you visit are basically moments in life. The first chapter of Holy Communion is really about childhood and entering into the church and my very first conflicts with the church. I didn't want to be the bride of Christ. I didn't want to kiss the ring of the bishop. I did want to wear the veil. And I was crazy for the pearl and the lace socks. And so people say, why do you call it the Holy Communion moments through the end? And I said, because it was the last great fashion moment where everything was perfect. But then I moved on and I began to look at other ways when I talked earlier about containment. And that's really the second chapter, the harem and other enclosures. And I began to imagine, after a visit to Istanbul for the third biennial, what did those women do in that place? Only 20 of them out of the 350 ever saw the Sultan. And his mother picked the ones that got to visit him. And they were none of them Turkish. They came from Europe, they came from Asia, they came from Africa. And essentially, they were enslaved in their own way. And so I began to look at that harem as this containment. And then I thought of Sor Juana, how Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, that great, great scholar, who was probably a greater mind than all the people who were her peers in the church. But she was rendered really silent over the years because they didn't want her to talk about, she was first asked to speak of the mercy of Christ. And the minute she wrote it down, it was over for her. You don't write it down. That's theology. And that's the purview of priests. So her scholarship, her first acknowledgement of the Black enslaved people's songs, the poetry in Nahuatl. She was a musicologist. She was a scientist. She was everything. And yet, in the end, she died taking care of other nuns because they didn't want her to be engaged in the liberty of the priest's world. So she became sort of my icon of hope when I was doing my dissertation. Her painting was a little print above my desk to help me go. And then the third part of the second chapter of the containment is the Virgin's Garden, the Hortos Conclusos. And I didn't really understand that. I thought my friend said the enclosed garden. I thought he said the closed garden. And since I love fashion, I had already had this idea that there was a big closet somewhere in the afterlife where all the virgins that we see, Extrem, Regla, Caridad del Cobre, San Juan de los Lagos, Guadalupe, they all ran in and out getting changed. Capes, crowns, scepters, rays, babies, a lot of babies. And I thought, well, I want that closet. So I started getting my mother to make little capes and clothes, because that's very much a tradition in Mexican Catholicism, the women who dress the little niño, antocitos, all of those things, the virgins. So that's how the Virgin's Closet and Garden came to be. And that second chapter, in some way, I didn't know I would go past that. And when I got to the third chapter, it was really because I'd struggled all of my life with my size, not just because I was always overweight or because in my generation I was like a giant. I mean, all the girls my age were 5 foot, 5'1", Chicanos, Mexicanos, and I was 5'6". Now I'm 5'2", so there you go. But at the time, I think I always felt that I couldn't fit. And then later I realized it's not my body, it's my personality. We were joking and people talking about what teachers wrote on your report card. Over-exuberant. Leading, a natural-born leader, but leading people the wrong direction. These were things that people wrote. Teachers wrote this about me, and I would take it in and feel really bad about myself and then think, well, hell, and I would get kicked out of school for cursing, and things happened that, just were part of the defiance that came about, I think, from living in a place that I didn't fit into and in a society that I felt disparaged me and my family in some way. So Cihuatlampa, the place of the giant women, is from the Mexican afterlife of Mictlan, where the Cihuateotls, who are the women who die in childbirth. Okay, girls, is that the only way we can be honored? The soldiers get medals. We die in childbirth. And then we get the job of carrying the sun to its setting every day, back and forth. And I used to think, they must be giants to carry that sun. And so I crafted the notion of the place of giant women. And I have to say that every chapter is a metaphor, which allows me to play around with the concept I have of being too big for the world I couldn't fit in. But it also allows me to explore geography, different time frames, colonial. I mean, it's a way to just make through the story the kind of enticement of new lands, as it were, so that people can go there and see things they haven't seen. And I'm very proud that Sama has premiered the first celestial Cihuateotl, because the terrestrial one got grabbed up by the Whitney, and I'm not complaining, but it was embarrassing because they'd already promoted the show with that image, and then I had to admit to them that it wasn't coming. Normally, the museum will allow a piece to go on in the show until the show is over. But they had a plan for a very large show calling Shifting Landscapes, on which this piece would be included. And so the last chapter I want to talk about in Finding the Form is probably the one that's the most potent for me, which is it's the road to Paris and its aftermath. And so people think, oh, you had an accident in Paris? I said, no, aftermath. I came home from Paris on my 60th birthday. Richard took me to Paris for my birthday because it's my favorite place in the world. It's very embarrassing that I'm a Francophile. But it's legitimate because my great-grandfather, or my uncle, Mariano Escobedo, for whom my grandmother was named, was the general of the North during the French intervention, and he took the sword from Maximilian to Celo de las Campañas. And so that's in private landscapes, public territories. It's in that piece. And so I come by my Frenchness, and my first name is Maxine. So jokingly, I was called Max, as in Maximilian. And my cousin was Charlotte, and she was Carlotta. So they were always around my house screaming, Max, Carlotta. And then we'd come running in, and we never got the joke. And it wasn't until I was 40 years old that I finally read the history and went, oh my God, that's my family. Oh, that's why I'm Max, and that's why she's Carlotta. So the Cihuatlampa is a Mesoamerican. The road to Paris is real time. It's what happened to Richard and I in an accident, a car accident, very, very serious one. And it's also just a story about survival and about healing. And I say this often, that for most of us, the space between birth and death is one of healing. We're constantly repairing and healing ourselves. Our bodies die off in different ways. We get new cells. We're always healing, always changing. And our final last healing is a relinquishing of our bodies so that we can go to whatever space we belong. And so for me, this piece of the Curanderas Botanica is dedicated to my grandmother, Mariana, whose picture is in the light box, because she helped heal my father when he was young. She wasn't a curandera, but she knew about curanderismo, which is the inseparability of the mind and the body, the connection between the living and the dead, and the ways in which the natural cures help us, and that no one becomes ill alone and no one can be healed alone. It's a collective healing. And when I had the accident, I suffered from susto, where my soul went from my body. It's what we call trauma or shock. And it took me many, many years to recover, still working on it. But that's the last chapter of the series. And I think beyond that, maybe we'd just go quickly to the Cabinet of Curiosities. Although we should show Transparent Migrations for our curator, Mari Carmen Ramirez, who's here, and she really wants to see that piece. There we go. It belongs to Houston. That's why, we talk of it in a very familial way. And we're going to end on the Cabinet of Curiosities, but you think Tomás has something to say about it?
Well, the Cabinet of Curiosities, Amalia, it seems that your work, all of your work, is a cabinet of curiosities. But one of the things that happened when a lot of the things were taken to Europe from the Americas, the objects were disintegrated from their context.
Yes.
So one of the things that you did in the Wunderkammern, the Cabinet of Curiosities, was that you repatriated all those objects from the Americas that were in the European aesthetic. The Europe had put them all into their own aesthetic, and so you reclaimed them and brought them back into the history of contemporary American art and the cultural heritage of Mexican Americans. Could you discuss this process of recuperation, reintegration, and redefinition in your Cabinet of Curiosities?
Thank you, Tomás. Beautifully said. I started getting interested in the cabinets of curiosity the same time I began to investigate World's Fairs, both systems of degradation of people of different races around the world. World's Fair had to make people look savage in order to be advanced and progressive. Cabinets of Curiosity organized things in fantasy lands that rich kings and princes and others who sent others to collect their objects. And I always said that the basis of the museum as we know it really comes from two trajectories. One, of course, is the Western Museum, the collector, and eventually the masters and the masterpieces. But there's another trajectory, and that is the Hall of Man and the ethnic object and the anonymous artisan. And we, in the, I would say, 80s, there was a collision in contemporary American art when artists like myself, Fred Wilson, Gomez Pena, you name them, they came together and they created work that could have belonged to either one, and they didn't quite know where to place us. And because I have been, politely saying, inquiring into museums for many years, I used to be mean and terrible, but I'm not anymore. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to be here now. But I did begin to think about the Wunderkammers, and I was very entranced by the conceptual frameworks that were used. The whole idea of the cabinets of curiosity as being colonial age fantasies and these preconceived imaginations of the world outside of Europe, and how this discovery really brought into their control objects that they would call mirabalia, being miraculous, or realia, being real. They made names for things and grouped them according to how foreign they seemed to them. But in fact, they were very real for us. You know, Frida Kahlo said it better than anybody when those surrealists tried to say that she was painting dreams. And she said, no, this is Mexico. This is not a dream. This is real. And I began to work with them. And of course, my greatest opportunity was to work with the Fowler Museum at UCLA in the New World Wunderkammer, where they let me come for 2 years and plunder their collections and select. And I was pursuing then the notion of mestizaje with the terza raíz, and I wanted to have both colonial Americas and African. So I had 3 areas of the cabinet with witnesses in each, and they let me select pieces, and I began to discover the whole aspect of war and genocide and enslavement that was going on through all of those pieces. And of course, African pieces being from spiritual traditions that are more active and with more agency were very different than the burial pieces coming out of Mesoamerica. They were calmer and different. And the colonial pieces, they didn't have much, but I took what I could, use things that had been important to me, the Mocas Coronadas, some of the casta paintings, the things that I thought were very evidentiary of what happened at the colonial age. But I built a lower portion called the Blessing section, because you can imagine, you're going into enormous collections. And friends who worked with me at the time, long distance, said, if there's any blood, don't take it, don't use it, because it means it was in a ceremony and you don't want that. And you know all the time that you're selecting pieces that have come into this collection against their will, and that there's a space somewhere in the world that they used to be, where people used to do certain things with that object. So my way of healing it in the end was to do a series of prints. And the museum understood they're all very progressive people there. And I showed pieces that had been in storage for probably 50, 60 years. and they were from a collection by a man named Henry Wellcome, who invented the first pill in Europe. People used to go to the chemist and get powders. So imagine the first pill, and he had the patent on it. So he became incredibly rich, and he began collecting things that had to do with medicine and eventually surgery and eventually war. And he collected over 1 million objects, but he died before he could ever build a museum. So only a very small group of like 35, 40,000 went to Fowler. And I was lucky enough to use those. So I think in many ways that the Wunderkammer takes us all the way around and back to the enchantment and wonder that Tomás has written about so very well. And I feel like I've had a chance to heal some pieces, and some will never be healed, nor will we. But at least we know our heritage. At least we know that once someone somewhere made these beautiful objects, used them in a dance, used them in a burial, sang with them, embraced each other with them, lived with them. These are potent things. And so to have the chance to do that was really one of the great moments of my art life.
Well, I think. Well, a few words in conclusion for this wonderful, wonderful evening. I wrote just a couple of paragraphs for Amalia. For nearly half a century, Amalia Mesa-Bains has created art of extraordinary expressiveness and consequence. From her initial recovery of domestic altars and ofrendas to her current exploration of systems of wonder in the Americas, Mesa-Bains' visions and representations haunt our imaginations as they mesmerize, delight, and enchant us. They open our eyes, hearts, and minds to the resonance and wonder of everyday life and art. The art and display strategies of Mesa-Bains' latest cycle of work. 1, integrate the trauma and legacy of colonialism in the Americas. 2, explore mestizaje as a mode of thought in artistic production. 3, examine the persistence of wonder and the marvelous in the tangible and intangible heritage and the cultural heritage of U.S. Latino life. In the mutable, ever-changing world we live in the landscapes, geographies, and mestizo worlds of the Americas, the luminous art of Amalia Mesa-Bains proclaims that nothing is too wonderful not to be true. So let it be. Y así sea. Gracias.
I know we're ending, but I really have to say this. You can see the generosity, the brilliance of Tomás, and you must understand that he's been my partner in thought and in creative cultural work for all these many, many years. And I am so very, very grateful.
Thank you both so much. That was absolutely fantastic. And you've been so generous in sharing your insights and stories with all of us. And thank you to David for this beautiful tribute. I know we're past time, but if there's a couple of questions, we can maybe take one or two from the audience. Yes, Chris.
Well, I'll speak for myself. It's just surviving at this point. But I have to say, learning to accept success. It's very hard. When you've been through a time in which your work isn't acknowledged, your community isn't acknowledged, you learn to fight for it and you learn to advocate for it. And you live that way for so long that when the good things come and people want it, your first question is, why? So I think my challenge right now is very Zen in a way. It's learning to accept what comes my way. And also, I want to say before closing that the only reason I'm here today is that I've had the most extraordinary husband anyone could or partner that the great Richard Baines. Really, come on, give the man a hand. Tomás, did you want to answer that one at all? No.
No.
Okay, maybe one more question if there's any burning questions in the audience. Yeah, yes, you, sir.
Earlier, the Frida Kahlo.
Oh,
And Frida was not known.
well, it's a good time to remark on because Maria Carmen Ramirez is here, and Houston is sponsoring a show that is going to look at that genesis as well as others. And we're very grateful because for many years we started, I think I did my first window or altar or like a little homage to Frida in 1975 because Richard and I had gone to the Blue House in 71 or 72, around there. And by that time, Rupert Garcia and Rene Yanez and others were already making images of her from the mid-70s on. And when we were at the Galeria de la Raza in the 70s, Ralph Maradiaga was, along with Rene, one of the directors. And he was very interested in Frida because he knew Emmylou Packard, Lucien Dimitrov-Bloch, Pili Delap, Ella Wolf. They all lived in San Francisco where Frida and Diego had been visiting and living for parts of the time. And Emmylou Packard had studied with Rivetta and had gone back to live with her and Frida, after the second marriage, I think. So we knew many, many things about her, and Ralph had always encouraged us to write a book. We were never able to do it, but in my archive are all the interviews that we did. And out of all of those interviews, one thing happened. We learned about what it is to live an artist's life. Lucien Dimitrov-Bloch and Stephen Bloch were the most extraordinary couple you would ever want to meet. They were doing frescoes in their 80s. They had been with Rivetta on the mural at Detroit. They are the ones that discovered the broken fragments of the Rockefeller mural in the garbage cans and called Rivetta. So we decided at the Galeria to do the homenaje. And part of it was trying to educate people, other artists and culture workers, who she was. So starting in 75 and 76, we started doing slideshows. We would take pictures from books, and we, from the interviews, we could give sort of data. And Rupert Garcia made an annotated biography of her, bibliography. And so we'd go to all these libraries, junior colleges, anywhere one would ask us, and give these stories on Frida. And that went on for about a year and a half until 78, when we could actually do the homenaje. I did an ofrenda for Frida and Diego at the Fifth Sun show in Berkeley in 1977, I believe. And so then in 78, we did the homenaje. And shall I tell the story? Oh, it's very short. Hayden Herrera had finished her book then, but we didn't know too much about it. We had gone to Chicago. No, we'd gone to La Jolla to see the show that was traveling to Chicago. But we never met her. So then the night of the homenaje opening, she came. So we thought Hayden Herrera, we thought she was a, like Chicanos with a name like Tiffany or something, like, oh, she's Hayden. And so in walks this like very tall Bryn Mawr blonde, and we go, oh my God, this is Hayden. She was lovely. But when she picked up the Rivetta ofrenda, the sugar skull off the ofrenda, which she weren't supposed to do in the first place, it slipped through her fingers and it shattered on the floor. And we just all said, they're going, ay, Dios mío, what's going to happen next? And so we went ahead with our view of her. And I always say, I love her interpretation of the artwork. I think it's excellent. But you really shouldn't judge a person by the love letters they wrote when they were 16 years old. None of us would want to be known that way. So I think, there are many, many stories about Frida. She's been you know, the girl never goes away. She just never goes away. Right now, Mari Carmen's working on this extraordinarily broad-based show. Trish Ziff, the filmmaker, is working on another one. Adriana Zavala is working on a book. I mean, it's still going, and it will continue to go, because she never stops being compelling to each generation. We never saw her as a victim. We saw her as a sort of stalwart. You know, we saw the Mexicanidad movement as a model for the Chicano movement. We saw them as cultural advocates and practitioners. They were the first, along with others like Siqueiros Orozco and others, who were coming out of the revolution, coming out of the whole process of Mexicanidad, where you were drawing back into the ancient life and tossing off that European porfiriata that you had been living with. And so, you know, she remains a sister. We're sort of in solidarity with her. When I was younger and I had to have a hysterectomy, a very female operation, and I took a picture of her, which I'd stolen out of an archive, I shouldn't say that. It was in a frame though, and I put it on the little side table next to my hospital bed, and the Filipino nuns came in, they go, ay, qué bonita, qué santa estás. That's Santa Frida. And so I canonized her in that very moment, and she's been with me ever since. And when I went through the accident and broke all these bones and was, you know, in recovery and hospitals and intensive cares and just months and months and months and years, she was always with me. She was always with me. So I think of her in a very personal, intimate way. And something that I didn't forget, I never met her. Pardon? Oh, no. As an activist. Remember the last picture of her in her wheelchair when Jacobo had been assassinated and they were doing the protests about Guatemala? I remember that picture of her. It stands out to me who she really was. Nothing stopped her, not even the end. And we just hope that she is in paz, descansando.
I just wanted to say that Amalia,
Yeah.
That's absolutely right. Thank you all so much for being here with us tonight. Amalia Mesa-Bains' Archaeology of Memory will be on view here through January 12th, so please come back and visit us many, many times. Good night.